Okay, good morning and welcome to this e-Memoir session, ensuring an effective organisational response to the apprenticeship reforms. I'd like to keep the sessions as interactive as possible, so please feel free to use a question or chat facility or indeed your microphone to put any questions or thoughts to Beej. You'll all be receiving a copy of the video recording along with the slides and encourage you to share the slides with your colleagues and come back to us with any questions or thoughts you have following. Session should last for about an hour. I'm going to hand over to Beej. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Marek, and good morning to those that are listening in, and also good morning to those of you who have registered for today but might actually be just using the recording at a later date, either for personal listening or perhaps sharing with your team through some kind of training and development or through a team meeting. Particularly welcome to our subscribers who, again, thanks very much for supporting us. This morning, I want to look at ensuring an effective organisational response to the apprenticeship reforms. Here, and by the way, I'm focusing on us as training organisations, whether you be a college, an independent learning provider, or a local authority or other third sector provider. And of course, here I also want to talk to those of you who employers have chosen to become employer providers. We are running a series of events, and I've been running a series of events, including workshops for the employers, giving them an awareness of some of the things that they should have done by now in preparation for the introduction of the levy and other things that are going to happen after the 1st of May. So, as Marek said, we're happy to take questions and comments as we go along. If we can't answer them during the presentation, we'll make a note and then obviously come back to you. By the way, not individually, unless you tell us that it's only an individual, we tend to share the answers with everyone else. So to sort of get us started, I think it's important just to remind ourselves of the timeline, and thanks very much to City and Guilds for a nice easy graphic that tells us that, of course, now as we're moving into the end of March, we would have in some cases been made aware of some of the changes that have actually occurred. So we're fairly clear about the fact that it's going to be from the 1st of May. We now know if we're on the register of apprenticeship training providers or not, and also, there is an opportunity, obviously, as we're waiting to find out about the first round of applications for the non-levy paying procurement that was also released at the same time. And I just want to go back. I think we've got a bit of an issue with the way that the screen's working, but also to remind ourselves that there will be a second round of applications for the register. We now know the date for that. And of course, that's going to be allowing some people to come onto the register that haven't been on the register. We still don't know the results of the procurement. And of course, the important thing is that everything will start in terms of the payments being made from employers' accounts from April through HMRC, and then obviously the availability in the digital accounts from May. And in many cases for us as providers, the first payments coming to us in June. I think you're all aware of the apprenticeship funding policy, so I don't need to sort of repeat this, but you can see that clearly in this little diagram where the changes have been, the funding rates that are going to apply to all frameworks and standards after the 1st of May. The levy obviously is 0.5% of those employers that have a pay bill of more than £3 million a year. The co-investment rate for non-levy paying has been set at 10%, the government paying the remaining 90%, with all of the additional payments which will not come through the digital account or will not be part of the negotiations that you as providers have with employers. That includes the 16 to 18 uplifts, the fact that the small employers will have 100% of the cost of the apprenticeship covered, the additional learning support that again will come to you as providers, the disadvantage uplift for 1 year will come to you, the English and Maths will come to you as a provider, and of course all of that makes the funding of your apprenticeship provision either better or at least the same, or in some cases it still doesn't compensate you for some possible loss when all of the existing rates were transferred to these new funding rates. The actual levy itself, I think we're all clear, it's a UK levy, but applies only in England, so that proportion of what employers will pay into the levy is dependent on what proportion of their workers are ordinarily resident or working in England. We know that the 24 months rather than 18 months is there for the expiration of digital accounts. We know that the digital accounts will be topped up by 10% for the levy payers, and we know obviously that your existing learners, those that are continuing, will of course be covered by existing arrangements for frameworks and standards even after the 1st of May. And therefore, that what we're talking about in terms of preparation for the reforms, it relates to those new starts. We also know that in the first instance, you will not be able to transfer a proportion of your funds to, say, other employers in, say, the supply chain or through the apprenticeship training agencies. That will not happen until 2018. So, I mean, I think we're all fairly familiar now with the reforms. I'm sure you've attended sessions or you've actually run sessions, particularly if you're a provider. I'm sure as part of your preparedness for this, you've run sessions for, or you've provided newsletters or some kind of text for employers, for potential apprentices, and hopefully also for parents and the wider community. And I'll come back to that as part of the key aspect of your strategy. So what I really want to look at is what sort of organizational responses do we have to make in terms of making the most of the opportunities provided by the apprenticeship reforms. And I think we've got to be fairly positive. I know there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of things that we're not quite clear about. There's concerns about what might happen after the 1st of May. But I think we've got to take on a fairly positive attitude to make sure that we do take advantage of those opportunities when they become real. And that requires these various aspects in terms of your preparedness, and that's what I'm going to talk about for the next 40 minutes. Has your organisation got a clear vision and strategy for apprenticeships? Has that included a really thorough appraisal of the opportunities and threats posed by apprenticeship reforms? And that really starts with a solid, what I call, root and branch review of your current provision and your current performance if you're already an apprenticeship provider. If you're not an apprenticeship provider, and we know we've got a couple of you who you've been subcontracting in the past or not done any apprenticeships in the past, then obviously this starts with a capability analysis, which I think is critical. It's how to make use of the different things that are available, the apprenticeship service, the National Apprenticeship Service, and all the other sort of devices and other agencies that are there to support you, the apprentices, and other decision makers. And then I really want to focus on 4 aspects of what I'd call a detailed strategy becoming an operational set of plans. Marketing and employer engagement, which I see as absolutely critical. Your pricing and payment strategy, which again is quite critical. And then how you comply with regulations, including, of course, contractual issues, as well as compliance with funding regulations and funding rules. And last but not least, how far you've got on with your workforce development strategy. And I think that's very critical because we've got to see the apprenticeship reforms as one of the biggest changes in post-16 education and training, certainly since the introduction of NVQs in the 80s. And I think with that in mind, we do really need to see this as quite a fundamental shift, not only in our markets, but also in how we supply those markets in terms of things like standards as opposed to frameworks. But it's critical that we actually do this first. And I think this is one of the things that I've been anxious as, not only as a director of Learning Curve, which is a provider of apprenticeships, but as a governor of a medium-sized college, which is quite significant in its apprenticeship provision. So I can see it from different angles and different perspectives, is if we're already an apprenticeship provider, then of course it should be business as usual. The danger with looking at the changes and the reforms is that we mustn't lose sight of how important it is to give the very best service to our existing and continuing apprentices, to their employers, and obviously to the wider community. So we must make sure that in looking to prepare ourselves for the apprenticeship reforms, and in some cases we started certainly that last year, well into last year, is to make sure that the quality of our existing provision is not diminished in any way as we consider those how best to respond. So we've had to do business as usual as well as look at business in the future. What we have found very useful, and hopefully you have as well, even if you didn't necessarily apply the first time or get on in the first occasion, is the process of applying for the Register of Apprenticeship Training Providers and the first procurement, for example, for non-levy paying, actually allowed us to test some of those plans, some of those assumptions, and basically our preparedness for the reforms. And I think, therefore, it's reassuring that if you are on the register, then you've obviously already shown there's a significant state of preparedness and confidence, and particularly confidence on the part of the funders that you will be, from the 1st of May, you'll have the capacity, the capability, and the readiness to make a good job of supplying both levy-paying employers and non-levy-paying employers. And at the same time, you know, if you haven't taken advantage of some of the development programs being offered by ETF, and support from the Association of Employment and Learning Providers, as well as the Association of Colleges, and various checklists that have been, and we've used those checklists and modified them to our own needs, then I think you've obviously missed some opportunities there. Please do that, and there is a lot of support being available at the moment. Take advantage of it, particularly if you're a member of those different associations. So let's start with that, I think, that top-level strategy and vision for apprenticeships. I think the reforms do allow us, particularly those of us who are already apprenticeship providers of both frameworks and standards, to say, let's just start again and have a clear look at what all of this means for our apprenticeship offer. This means we've got to engage actively as leaders and managers, so at board level, at governor level, as well as obviously at the leadership team level, as well as the managers, but also to establish with everyone that works in the organization, whether it be support staff, whether it be the people that work in the organization as assessors, tutors, the people that work in management information, finance, the people that work in HR, that actually this is a whole organization change. It isn't just the apprenticeship team. And I think that's what worries me about some organizations is, well, it's them over there in business development and apprenticeship and work-based learning that are actually having to make these changes. I think it's got to be a clear direction for the whole organization. That obviously starts with a clear analysis of our opportunities and threats. So how are you responding to those external changes in terms of what's happening with apprenticeship frameworks and standards? But at the same time also to make sure we're aware of what threats there are either externally to us predominantly, but also those wider threats that might occur in what's happening at the national level. And I think understanding the changes to markets, because the introduction of the levy and the co-investment fundamentally changes the market for apprenticeship learning. And I know I've done several webinars on that. But also the nature of the offer changes with the movement from frameworks to standards, and the expectations of employers have changed quite significantly. That's got significant implications. You cannot just simply plan and provide as you have done, or maybe have done in the past for apprenticeships. You've got to review things much more fundamentally. And that also means lining up not only with the priorities of employers, whether they're large or small, but also the priorities of the local enterprise partnerships, the combined authorities, and what the funding agencies are looking for, particularly in response to some of those national agendas, the skills plan, the industrial strategy, etc. And I think that more fundamental strategic review, the sort of what I call the brutal facts approach, means that we'll have to make some key decisions on which apprenticeships to offer, at what level, and what scale. Now, in some cases, that might mean you might expand the offer because there's the demand. In some cases, you might consolidate. In some cases, you might actually reduce the offer, particularly where demand is not there, where it's not a priority or quality is an issue. And this should then find its way into the detail of your curriculum and business planning, not just for the next year, I would say right through to 2020, when obviously the whole of the sector will be judged on how well it's responded to the growth in apprenticeship starts to the 3 million mark, and also what's happened to the quality of that. And I think one of the messages that certainly I picked up from working with a partner college, which is a really good college that we've been working with, is they have a very simple message. Focus on what we're really good at. So which apprenticeship frameworks and standards are really good at, which employers are really good at meeting the needs of, and then work hard to achieve that. And that, I think, will, particularly if you do that through an apprenticeship board or establishing, say, a working group to do that, which includes employers, which includes existing apprentices, I think that fundamental change is absolutely critical. I call it eyes wide open. And from that should then start to, come an analysis of the opportunities and threats, the review, and obviously then the more operational issues around marketing, workforce development, contracts, etc. The danger is it's quite easy to get into the detail of how the funding is going to work, the issues about contracts, etc., as well as obviously reporting, monitoring, how to operate, what pricing, etc. When in fact sometimes we will simply have to say, well, wait a minute. At the strategic level, are we in the right market? Are we the right people to deliver these apprenticeships before we get into the detail? I think there's significant opportunities. For example, the increase in public funding for apprenticeships, which will be, over $2.5 billion, there's an increase there. There's a significant increase in demand for higher apprenticeships as part of the industrial strategy. I think particularly moving over to standards, particularly in science, technology, engineering and maths, provides a greater return, greater opportunity to make margins there. I think all of this provides us a golden opportunity to change our curriculum and shift the focus to LET priorities, or possibly priorities at the regional, and if you're a national provider, clearly to plug into the national priorities. I think the relationship that we're fostering with employers as we work with them through this process, particularly I found in the sort of briefings that we've been doing face-to-face with employers, it's often provided other opportunities. For example, all right, we might be providing intermediate and advanced level of frameworks at the moment and some standards at level 3, but we've also been able to activate demand for management training at level 4 to 6 and some other of those higher apprenticeships. Seeing this totally from a more personal point of view, it's almost a selfish point of view. In both cases, the organisations I work with and our partners are actually performing better than the benchmarks, certainly better than the national average, and therefore to some extent we can exploit the poor performance of some providers to make our offer more attractive. Now, I know that's not a sort of, if you can see that in a most positive of ways, but in effect it does give us some opportunities to fill those gaps when there's issues about quality. I think the other thing that we've learned certainly is by working with other providers through, say, an apprenticeship company, through consortia, we're actually able to offer some of our employers, particularly those employers who are large employers who don't want to activate a whole range of providers. They might want to work with one provider or with a group of providers to cover all of the different standards and sectors that they might actually have in their employment, is certainly an opportunity for us. And I don't know if any of you that are listening in, have you actually started to look at collaborating and partnering with other providers to make your offer stronger and take opportunity, particularly to work with some of the larger employers, the levy-paying employers? Because we certainly have, as a college, we're working with others to do that. And obviously, if possible, also link that up with an awarding body and other agencies that might be critical in helping us achieve those aims. Can I just check then, from those of you listening in, have any of you actually considered or are considering working as part of a group, saying it as a partnership, a consortium, or as an apprenticeship company as your response to these changes? And I think we've got one of you already responding yes, you're working with another provider as part of a group to do that. And I think, again, that's taking advantage of some of the changes that are there. I think one of the important thing is that through the levy and the fact that the employers are paying that levy, we've actually activated some new demand, particularly from some of the larger employers that didn't use apprenticeships before. And critically for me, that, rather than a non-levy paying employer theoretically have to pay us 50% of the cost of a framework if they're working with adults, or 33% if it's a standard, I think the reduction to 10% does bring this within the purview and certainly within the capability of some more employers, especially the smaller employers, particularly if they're employers with less than 50 staff. So again, I think that's a useful thing to remember. And I think also, and as one of you said, yes, we're at, thank you very much, we're also doing it because we're merging with another organisation, and also linking up with your subcontractors, which I think, again, is strengthening the offer. And please, I think, start thinking about those opportunities, particularly where we're talking to large employers who might not want to contract with a whole lot of smaller providers. And certainly we've heard that from several in the retail and in the servicing sector have said, why don't you work as a consortium? It's easier for us to then obviously contract with you as a group. And so that, I think, has got these are the opportunities. There are significant threats. Some of them are just specifically around the nature of the changes. What's going to happen with endpoint assessment? How are employers going to respond to these changes, particularly the small employers? But I think there are more fundamental issues. There's uncertainty in the national economy and in specific sectors, which in fact, although we see all the opportunities, they might actually be divesting themselves of staff. They might not be doing any new recruitment. They might be contracting. And of course, we don't know what's going to happen with Brexit, etc. I think there's a lot of uncertainty over employer investment plans in terms of both physical and human capital. So when you start asking employers, can we do an organizational needs analysis to identify where your training needs are, they're saying, hang on, everything, we're putting that on hold. We don't know what's going to happen. We've got other issues such as maybe mergers, etc. And obviously one of the other significant threats is that some of the larger employers will run their own apprenticeship scheme, and if they become a provider, an employer provider, might actually start offering apprenticeships to other staff, and that could obviously be a major competitive push against you, as the opportunities for lots of new entrants to come into the market. You know, HEIs have been successful in getting through the register. They're obviously looking at higher apprenticeships, but there's nothing to stop them once they've got the track record to looking at a broader range, and of course the employers themselves. I think for parents, learners and the wider community, one of the significant threats is there's still branding and reputational confusion. In other words, even though we've invested so much in promoting apprenticeships, there are still some negative connotations, some what I call default situations around apprenticeships which are not positive, and that's, you know, going to affect any potential we've got there. I think we've still got issues about how well the digital apprenticeship, the apprenticeship service will work, the digital account, endpoint assessment, will the management information systems be there, will the whole thing work, you know, beautifully from the 1st of May. And I think the other threat is that, you know, we are moving from gradually replacing frameworks by standards, we're moving for transition, but that process itself is not very even. And in some cases, it's taking a lot longer. And that obviously makes it difficult for you to decide exactly which of those things you're going to offer and where you're going to make the significant investments. Both the opportunities and threats really do then provide you with an opportunity to say, well, let's review the fundamental offer, let's review our capabilities, and let's actually take account of those. And if the threats far outweigh the opportunities and you've got some significant internal capability issues, for example, inconsistent quality, a lack of appropriately trained staff, or assessors in the right areas, then one of the sensible decisions might be to contract your provision, or if necessary, withdraw from the apprenticeship market. And this, I think, is going to be one of the occasions when that has to be a very serious consideration for some providers. So that review of current provision, one of the things, and it could be, you know, a root and branch review of all the strengths and weaknesses. I'm sure you do that through the self-assessment process, bring that in line, absolutely critical. One thing I'm interested in is, well, if I just take my existing offer across the two organizations I'm associated with and run it into next year, will it still be financially viable? So that means we've got to look at the new funding bands and impact on margin. I'm sure you've done that as part of your preparedness. And here are some examples. You can see that in business admin at level 3 for a 16 to 18 apprentice, you know, that if we look at the framework compared to standard, there is actually about the same margin for us, slightly better. Whereas if we look at health and social care level 2, if we look at the pre-levy framework, you can see the margin. The post-levy framework, you can see it's significantly reduced. But even if we move over to the standard, the margin is significantly less. And that obviously creates issues for about our ability to offer and make that offer viable. For example, if we've got, you know, 50% of our apprentices are in health and social care, that's a significant loss of income. And that obviously has got to be taken into account when we're deciding on what provision to make and how much of it to make. Now also we have to blend that with what we know not only internally but externally about local market intelligence, what's happening in the labour market, the LEP priorities, as well as what does our current provider funding report tell us in terms of where the patterns of growth are. So for example, our data tells us that apprenticeships in hairdressing are declining in our area, apprenticeships in beauty are expanding. So we've got to take account of that in terms of our future planning. And we seriously have had to look at the delivery model needing to change, not only in terms of the standards, but even within the existing frameworks. If we need to improve quality or get better outcomes, then what do we have to do in terms of our delivery model, our relationship between off-the-job training and on-the-job training, day release, block release, online learning, etc. And I think there are more fundamental changes there. And also keep on looking at this as when you're looking at your current provision and want to offer it to the new starts after the 1st of May, what's the price? What is the value that you can add through things like recruitment, selection, helping to design the delivery, accessing other products that are available to the employer? Obviously, you've got to look at that, but again, versus how much that's going to actually generate in real business. My other particular issue is, I think, and I'm looking at just two providers that I'm aware of, and I've just made the data look a little bit better in terms of, they've both got roughly the same size cohorts, but just look at the difference here between provider A and B in terms of the overall achievement rate, the timely achievement rate, which in both cases are well below the provider type benchmark and they're below the national benchmark. And you can just see that clearly provider A, if that one has not changed its offer and not done a written branch review, is in a very poor position to take advantage, whereas provider B, whose performance both for overall achievement rates and timely achievement rates, as well as the number of learners below the threshold, is very good. So provider B for me would be looking at the future with certain confidence and optimism, and certainly I think would be looking for growth, whereas provider A I'd be looking for either significant change in its model of delivery, its quality assurance, and certainly that would not be one that would feature in a lot of the plans for the future unless it radically changed its offer. So it gives us an opportunity to look at the opportunities and threats, to review our current capabilities, what's there to facilitate and help. Have a look at the apprenticeship service, because I think it's going to help employers to do all those things they want to do, selecting the frameworks, the training provider, the assessment organisation for endpoint assessment, and obviously making sure that those vacancies are there. It's also there critically, obviously, for you as the provider, because you've got to make sure that you use the apprenticeship service for publicising vacancies and for obviously offering your services as well. And obviously for all of us who are levy paying employers, we've also got to be able to use the digital account to be able to show us what we've got to spend, to agree the price, and obviously pay through the digital account, as well as use that obviously for collecting the information that we need for the SFA, etc. And don't forget, obviously, we've had the Employer FE Choices survey that was done this month. That's again helpful to tell us what employers think about the quality of service they're getting. By 2020, of course, I think employers will be able to use the apprenticeship service not only to identify the opportunities, to find the vacancies, etc., to post the vacancies, to find the training providers, but also to pay for their assessment and training. So a very important development there if you're not aware of it. I know it's slightly dated this, but obviously it's really useful for the learners, for potential apprentices, to know where they can find apprenticeships, and that's how well we put that information on and make it available to them. So as part of the marketing and employer engagement strategy, which I really want to focus on, I think there's some significant issues here. And I think I start by saying it's a new market. It is radically different because of the levy and the co-investment. It's a new market, it's a new product. The standard is very different from a framework. So I think we've got this opportunity to say, right, let's build a brand and a position in the apprenticeship market if we haven't done so. If we need to rebuild it, particularly if I was provider A, then I have to take that opportunity to do it. That means I might contract, I might rebase and become a provider of less apprenticeship opportunities, but better quality. Now that I think is critical, and I think if your organisation has already done this, well done, because I think you've got to see it as a new market, a new range of products, and therefore it's been a useful thing to say, well, let's build a different brand. Let's put a position in the market, not necessarily around quantity and targets, but maybe around quality, about progression, about making a difference to your business and to your future prospects as an apprentice. I know some of you, and one of you has already said, you've had to rebrand because you've merged. That's a golden opportunity to say, well, how do we build that brand that's got the strength of the merger and possibly overcoming some of the weaknesses that might have been there with one of the partners. Now, I know that you've all been involved because I've serviced some of you. I've been to employer events, quite a lot of them, where I've briefed 60 to 70 employers on what the change is about. I know you've used mail shots, site visits. I know a lot of you, we certainly visited all the big employers, the levy-paying employers that we have a common interest with. We've had guest presenters at events. We've had newsletters. I'm looking here at a good example from the Newcastle and Stafford College group of the type of publicity they've made available to employers, but also to very specifically to potential trainees, school leavers, and their parents. So I think it's that multifaceted approach. But of course, you can't do that if all you're doing is promoting a brand that looks staid, that doesn't have value written into it, that's got weaknesses. And I think that's critical. And therefore, we've had to make sure that we have an appropriate way of communicating to other businesses. So hopefully you've got publicity that's appropriate and promotions that are appropriate, and a way of engaging other businesses, employers, for example, and other agencies that might be involved with the right language, as well as more pertinent business to community communications, for example, to parents, to schools, and to the wider community. And I certainly have seen that through the way that, and you can see the preparedness of some providers very clearly just from their websites, which do seem to have a very clear proposition and a clear brand that they're promoting to those employers. Others, it's still looking a little bit hazy, and it still looks a little bit like the past. Obviously, the partnership with key partners such as the LEPs, the chambers, particularly if you can sponsor them or they sponsor you, you can see the advantages of engaging all those different routes that will give you an opportunity then to deliver a very comprehensive and good quality apprenticeship offer. For me, with existing students and existing learners and their parents, it's been absolutely critical that we've targeted them, for example, our level 2 learners, our study program learners, our adult education budget learners that are doing English and Maths at the first level 2, even our loan funded learners who tend to be older learners. We've put information out to them about the opportunities that exist in terms of apprenticeships, particularly in some of those STEM subjects and those higher funded ones. And I think also one strategy that I've certainly promoted, and I don't know if any of you have done, is once you engage the employer, whether it be a levy paying employer or not, one of the things that we found quite useful is that we have, as a provider, either as a college or as a training provider, a clear engagement strategy for employers with all the structures and support around it. What was interesting was one of the employers said, well, can you help us devise a training provider engagement strategy so that we know how best to engage with different training providers? For example, what questions to ask them, what do they mean? What is the difference between a college, a general FE college, a sixth form college? What's this, and it's about clarifying some of the things that they often have confusion. And we found, for example, that some employers were still bit confused about frameworks and standards, about the levy and the non-levy. And I already pay a levy if I'm in construction. What's this other one about? So I think that's really useful thing for you to do. For me, it's putting yourself in the employer's shoes. Now, I know some of you listening in are levy payers. So you already are the employer, and you're obviously deciding how to spend your levy. Well, I'm sure it's exactly the same sort of questions that will come in. When the employer is looking at the whole range of providers and the offer they're making, particularly if they're levy paying and they know that they've got a significant amount to expend each month, then, I think we've got to assist them to ensure that whatever investment they make in apprenticeships, in the talent, whether it be new talent or existing talent, delivers exactly what the employer is looking for, which is enhanced performance, increased efficiency, and improved productivity. So by putting ourselves in the shoes, I know that certainly a lot of employers I've spoken to, first thing they ask me is, what's my track record? How long have been in business? How long have been offering apprenticeships? And have we got commendations or awards that tell us how good we are? I think the other question that I'm often getting is, what added value, are we going to make? Can we, for example, take some of the administrative burden off them if they're a particular levy payer? Can we do a skills audit for them? So they're looking for added value as well as possibly selling up full price provision, which of course they would think is very, very useful for them in terms of enhancing their offer. Some of them have asked us how well we will embed work-based learning in the organisation. And it then becomes part of the whole organization. So that all the parts of that, for example, if it's a large retail company or, for example, a National Health Trust, how do we embed work-based learning in all the different departments rather than just one or two using up a lot of the levy? What they've asked significantly is our ability to scale up. Can we deliver if the employer has got more than one office or more than one presence on more than one location? if we're able to scale up, can we offer more than one framework or standard? We often get that question. Can we access a wider range of standards to meet our needs because they want breadth and they don't necessarily want to deal with different providers? They do ask us if we're able to help them design and deliver the programs, and will we use them to help design and deliver the programs and involve them particularly in some of the assessment work that's critical if it's standards. And obviously they have to be involved in determining whether the trainee is ready to go through the gateway. So I think, you know, all of these things are very important, but one of the questions that I think you should be able to now certainly put to yourself is, can you actually help the employer source the talent? In other words, can you help them with recruitment, attraction and selection? And that means sourcing the candidates in the first place. And I found that a really useful way of engaging with employers, particularly on new developments such as a retail development. We go in at the very front end of that before even the first building is put together. When we look at the development team, we look at the developer and the contracts team, and we say to them, what kind of talent are you looking for? We'll be able to supply that. Is it 18 months away? Obviously, we've got students already recruiting through the study program or through our AEB, or we've got other apprentices that are working through our ATA that we can place with you when that plant or that factory or that shop or that distribution point becomes available. And I think that sourcing talent is one of the ways that we can start to say and differentiate ourselves. It strengthens that brand, it strengthens that reputation. And it means also that we, you know, in a more broader sense, one of the organizations that, for example, one of my colleagues has been working with has then said, well, we're using apprenticeships to improve our business performance, but we're also using apprenticeships to try and change the culture of the organization, to make it more focused on the needs of customers. How can you help with that? It's not just through apprenticeships, and all of a sudden we're talking about management change, we're talking about cultural change, and we're talking about CPD that we're offering on a wider range. So again, you know, does this resonate with you? If there's any, how much do you think your organization has done in terms of using the reforms as a good opportunity to rethink your engagement strategy and start to put more energy into working with those markets and the very, what I call the key motivators? So how many of you believe that your organization has got a really good approach to marketing, employer engagement, branding, and relationships with, and are there some positives coming out of your experience of preparing for the apprenticeship reform so far? And obviously one of you has, because I've actually mentioned you. Thank you very much, because you've obviously done a lot of work to work with employers, and I've seen your stuff. And yeah, that's good. I think we can see that. Yeah, lots of sessions, and I must admit, I've done some of those sessions for you, not just as you as a provider, but on behalf of a group of providers to a group of employers. So there's been much more of a comprehensive, I think, quite good way of working at it at the regional level. So again, thanks for that question and that comment. That's very positive. And I think that's absolutely critical. You know, I think that, for example, the reason I focused on this for Small Businesses Federation, or the Federation of Small Businesses, because they're very distinct. But look at the details. They work predominantly with 16 to 19-year-olds, predominantly at level 2. 79% of recruiters. Have you targeted them using the language and the thing that motivates them? Because what motivates them is giving young people training opportunities. They're looking for a positive impact on their businesses. And if you've got case studies, then that really works, but also they're looking for a cost-effective solution. So you know that's going to be an aspect of the discussions that you're going to have around pricing and payments. But also look at some of the things that small firms, that the Federation of Small Businesses have told us about apprenticeships. You know, that 2 in 3 retain their apprenticeships, so that's going to help you. But 1 in 4 say lack of time to devote to training to an apprentice is a challenge to take them on. So you've got to make sure you address that issue by helping them design the training, helping them to deliver the training, and particularly the way in which you use the 20% of the job training. So I think there are some very important messages here about knowing each one of your markets and what are the key motivators in that market. So thanks for that feedback. For me, pricing and payment strategy has taken up a fair bit of time. You're familiar with the new 15 bands that apply to all frameworks and standards that start after the 1st of May. We know that every apprenticeship will be placed there. You know that you as a provider will be negotiating the best price for the training that the employer provides. By the way, if you're a provider that's offering apprenticeships to your own staff, you won't be negotiating a price. You'll have to estimate what the average price, what the average cost is going to be, the estimated cost, at the beginning of the apprenticeship, and at the end, then you have to record the actual cost. And don't forget, of course, since you're a levy-paying employer, you will have a contract with the SFA. But I think what one of you have said is quite critical, is, and it relates back to the previous point, if I just go back to the previous point, whatever you're doing in terms of effective engagement, it's only as good as all the parts in your organization, in your consortium, or in your group. So if you're working with subcontractors, it can be difficult if those subcontractors are not only in different sectors, as one of you said, Melanie, but obviously in different parts of the country. But for me, that is perhaps where we have to make the investment, because you can't have one of your subcontractors not being able to push the consistency of the brand and your position. And remember, your brand is only as strong as its weakest bit. So in other words, you know, there's no point having, you know, 90% of our brand is tied with reputation and good news, and then finding that the 10%, which might be in a different part of the country, a different sector, isn't, because that pulls down. That becomes the default view of your brand. So we've got to make sure that and that, Melanie, for me, has been one of the big issues. Obviously, we are a subcontractor, but we also subcontract quite a lot of other people as a prime. So we're in both camps. It's been difficult to make sure, and I think you're quite right, but it's been worth the investment. It's been worth the investment. Now, we've done that mostly through web-based approaches, so that gives access to everyone. What I think is going to be critical is how you then behave when it comes to the negotiation on the price that you're going to agree with that employer. Now, remember the rules that have just been restated recently. You know, when you're negotiating the price has got to cover the cost of training and assessment, right? Not other things, and obviously be wary of that. Now, we've got a basic philosophy, and I know that some of you that we've talked to are the same. We always set the price at the full cost of the band. So, for example, if we've got an apprenticeship offer in band 11, we will set the price at £15,000, and that includes the cost of the training. And if it's an endpoint, if it's a standard, it also includes the cost of the endpoint assessment. We start on that price because we say to the employer, look, this is not about price negotiation, it's about value for money. And we will emphasize the quality. Now, there might be a different response if that employer then says, well, look, I'm offering you 5 apprentices in band 11, then we can start to have a discussion, but we don't compromise on that basic idea that it's not about a drive to get to the lowest possible price. Now, we might offer around this some of the incentives. So in other words, for your 15,000, you will get, you know, really good service from us. The 20% off the job in English and Maths will be excellent. We'll make sure we negotiate and discuss the training with you. In some cases, we might get an offer whereby the employer says, well, I'll pay you more than the band. And we've had that already. And that might be because the standard doesn't have a qualification. Now, if they pay us £16,000 for a band 11, then 15,000 is what will be recorded in the digital account, because that's the cost of training and assessment. Because the standard does not require a qualification, but the employers ask for that qualification, then that's a separate contract that we have for that £1,000 to cover that additional qualification. Or anything else that they might want as an added value proposition. For example, they might want on a day release, we've had one employee says they want day release, but it's discrete group. They will provide a group. They don't want them to mix with other trainees. That's okay, but obviously they're going to pay for that in addition to what's in the band. And of course, you've got to say, well, you know, will we help you find the talent? That's obviously part of your added value. When you say the quality of offer at that band at £15,000 is X, Y, and Z, it can include those things. But remember, no financial inducedness and certainly no return money back to you through any other means. Now, all of this will require a contract with the employer. I know it's going to come under compliance in a few minutes. I know one or two of you have said to me, well, can we see a contract? Now, you can obviously get your own solicitors to draw up a contract for you to take account of all these changes, particularly if they move to endpoint assessment. We've used the AELP, that's the Association of Employment and Learning Providers model contract, because we're members of AELP, and therefore it's been one of the pluses of being a member of the Association of Employment and Learning Providers. By the way, I've got a conference tomorrow in Coventry if you don't know about it. But what that helped us was, because although it was designed for levy paying employers, we've adapted it for non-levy paying employers and for employers who are both levy and non-levy. And you know that will happen if a levy paying employer hasn't got enough money in their digital account. If they want to pay for any extra apprenticeship training, they will have to go into co-investment. So that is, I think, is critical. Can I just ask how many already have got contracts in place? In other words, you've tested them and you'll be able to offer them for new starts to employers after the 1st of May. Just a show of hands of those who are listening in, how many have already got an employer contract, because obviously you'll have a contract if you're an employer with the SFA, but this is you as a provider have got contracts already in some form already. Yeah, good. Yeah, yeah, that's good. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And the question from one, how did AELP? AELP, I think, contracted a law firm. I don't know if it's called BDB. I think the initials are something like that, to actually do that and test them out. For me, the big issue is payment schedules. And I know I was in a college yesterday where that was a key issue in one of our discussions is, how are we going to get the 80% installment payments? Are we going to do it through direct debit? Are we going to do it through PayPal? How often are we going to issue the invoices? Thanks very much, by the way. One of you saying you're waiting for the AOC one. Good, that's good. Because if there's a model one, then it's going to be tested. So that's good. And that might save you some expensive legal cost if you try to devise your own. How many of you have already established payments arrangements? So potentially any employers you're going to work with, obviously you hope that you're going to work with the levy paying if you're on the ROATP, but obviously you're taking account of the possibility of working with some of your existing customers who will be non-levy paying, who will have new starts after the 1st of May. How many of you have already set up? Good. We got a few of you already set up direct debit arrangements. Some of you taking installments in 3 months in advance. Good. Invoicing through finance, yeah. So again, and don't forget, that's for the 80%, what used to be called on-program payments, the installments. You obviously have to make sure you're also a way of collecting the completion element, which is 20%, when either the standard is complete or the framework learning is complete. And I think what we've made sure is that by having, in effect, a project manager for each group of employers, and in some cases, if it's a large employer, they have a designated sort of account manager. They make sure the service is in place for levy payers, and therefore there are no concerns there, that they are very clear, this is already established, it's part of the service we're offering in terms of administrative support to some of those big levy payers. Because some of the big levy payers are saying, we want you to handle all the, what I'd call the spaghetti, they obviously control the money in the digital account. They can only see, they're the only ones that can see that, but they still want us to do a lot of the administrative work. So ways of working and a process in place, brilliant, good responses. That state of preparedness, I think, worries me when I talk to some providers and they say, well, we're still waiting for, we'll see what happens. We haven't really thought that one through in detail. I think the more detail you've done now, even if you might have to change some of the things last minute, is really, you're really sensible, particularly when you start looking at the way that the payments are going to come to you, right? Because obviously here's the installment payments for apprenticeships, the 80%. If, for example, you've got 16 to 18 on the framework, you also get a framework uplift of 20% of the maximum funding band. In both cases, 20% is retained. 20%, remember, is retained of the value of the price and obviously of the uplift on completion. So again, you can see that you've got to make sure that the employer knows when they're going to, that in that last month they might be making more a bigger payment than they've made in the previous months. They've got to be aware of that. They've got to be aware. And similarly, when you're looking at your earnings, you also want to make sure you know how your earnings are going to come to you from the additional payments for example, disadvantage, or the additional payments in terms of the £1,000 for you for employing a 16 to 18-year-old or a 19 to 24-year-old. They'll come after 90 days, after 365 days. And obviously the SFA will pay you those, and the SFA will also pay you the installments for English and Maths, which are in the framework as standard. Again, don't forget the no completion elements. Now, when I sit that down and look at each one of our potential apprentices, that starts to give me clarity, not only in terms of my profile of earnings, but how I have to make sure that the employer pays their bit. And obviously I'm also looking at the contributions, or sorry, not the contributions, but how much is going to come to me from the skills funding agency. And cash flow, I think, is critical here. So you can see your state of preparedness must have a very detailed financial plan as well. I know a lot of focus has been recently on compliance with regulations. You've seen the new funding rules and guidance. Make sure you're using the most up-to-date one, right? I don't know if it's version 4 or 5. There are new clarifications on financial inducements to employers, which I've already said. There's significant issues about making sure that you have everything in the evidence pack for new starts. Just use that as a checklist. I mean, it's not that different from the existing evidence pack every time you take on an apprentice, but just have a look at it, because there's little subtle changes, particularly if you've got standards and the way in which we make sure that the relationship with the apprentice and the employer is absolutely well and clearly understood. The contracts I've already talked about with employers, but make sure you've also looked at your contracts with subcontractors, which one of you has already said you've done. And those of you who will be contracting assessment organizations for endpoint assessment, again, look at the model contract for that, because I think that's very useful for you to use. All of those in place, all tested, make sure you've got admin systems to support them. One thing in particular which came out of the recent funding rules and guidance is, I think you have to produce a little bit more clarity for your employer of what normal working hours and 20% off the job is, particularly when you're looking at the detail that you have to provide in the contract for the employer. I would clarify it with lots of examples, you know, and I know it's a bit mundane, but you know, we've got engineering apprentices coming in next Monday. They come in at 9 o'clock, they stay till 6 o'clock. That's 9 hours off the job. That's done over 48 weeks. We then look at the typical working week over 48 weeks, because they get 4 weeks holiday plus public holidays, and then we work out what percentage that is. We also, when they come in on that Monday from 9 o'clock till 7 or 6 o'clock, we also calculate, we also do English and maths with them for an hour each time. So there's an hour of English and an hour of maths. That then is added on to the 20% of the off-the-job training, because remember, the English and maths is not part of the 20%. The employer knows exactly that. They also know that if any elements are online, how we record the online element. For example, if a person's released from, say, duties on reception to be able to do their English and maths online, we know that that's logging on, logging off. That's evidence of the 20% off the job. The more energy you put into that and clarify that, the better. We're not going to have problems in future. The ILR itself obviously has to change, and is changing to obviously take account of the levy and of the co-investment rates, but also to prove that you've collected the payments, the 10% from non-levy paying. So make sure that that links up. I would certainly try a single systems approach, whether it be Pro Solutions you're using or EBS or whatever you're using, so that it's easier to work quickly between the evidence of experience of the learner through ePortfolio or Smart Assessor, so that you know that all the activities taking place, how long that activity is taking place, how does that relate to the payment schedule, how does it relate to preparation for the gateway, etc. And the more I think, this is the big area for me of concern. I don't think all our systems necessarily do talk to each other. We seem to have a diversity of systems. Will they be able to work effectively with these changes from the 1st of May? And that is one that, our MI staff are working hard on. Transparent information to employers, particularly in learner progress, well, you have to do that, but you might have to invest a little bit more energy in that, particularly if you've got much longer standards now, which might be lasting 3 and 4 years. Also, that might lead to irregular activity, because in the first 2 years maybe of their manufacturing, we have to do more work with the learners, more hours, perhaps more payment, and less in the 3rd and 4th year. That's all got to be clearly explained. And also evidence. So timeliness of paperwork from assessors, workplace tutors is critical. And here it's making sure that the apprenticeship service data and payment systems we comply with. So you can see that on that alone, there is quite a lot of hard wiring that needs to be sorted out. And I'm not convinced that any provider I've worked with so far has got all of this totally sorted out. Well, don't forget, one of the reasons is I don't think the SFA has got it all sorted out. So that to some extent, some of the things that we're looking for haven't yet been clarified. So I think, you can't do much about that. But And clearly when you're working with levy paying employers, to have a schematic which was provided by the SFA, we still have contracts. Employers have got to have, for example, if it's a college that's also going to supply, which is a levy paying, we've got to have a contract with the SFA. And obviously if we're going to supply to our own staff, that even makes it more significant. Then we've got relationships with the different employers. We as providers also have to have a contract with an endpoint assessment organisation for the standards. We have obviously contracts with subcontractors. And obviously all of this has got to be in place to take account of the changes. With the non-levy, slightly easier because we're familiar with it. The SFA has a contract for us. Hopefully that will be announced in the next few days. We then obviously have an agreement with the employer to make sure that they understand that they've got to pay us the 10% and what's got to be their commitment in terms of on-the-job training and off-the-job training. We will still have to obviously contract with an endpoint assessment organisation on behalf of the employer, and obviously again with subcontractors. But again, you can see how all of these processes start to take shape when we look at the apprenticeship service data and payment schedules, the importance of submitting correct, timely, comprehensive ILRs, that data being then matched with all the activity that's coming through the apprenticeship service. So we're looking there at matching, making sure that everything in terms of the names, the apprenticeship frameworks, the right employer codes are being used, the right type of framework and standard, the right funding, etc. And then obviously that, you're submitting your final data. That's going to be leading to the payment and then the report to show the report of activity. And remember, reporting and monitoring will still be done by the SFA and that will be done on a monthly and annual basis. And obviously that's to enable all the payments to be made correctly, to ensure that you're delivering the training you've been paid to deliver and it's good quality, but also to keep track of learners and all their outcomes. So you can see how important all of this is to have this in place. And I think the last thing for me is, and it shouldn't be the last, to some extent we should have really started with this as part of our organisational strategic response, is this really means having a good look at the capabilities of our staff, not just the delivery staff, not just the workplace tutors, the assessors, the teachers, or the business development team or the apprenticeship team, but also administrative, finance and data staff should have been given training, updating on the systems, an awareness of how things are different. I've been doing whole staff sessions where it's not just the teaching staff or the training staff or the tutoring staff, it's also included all those people involved in administration of apprenticeships. And we've appointed project managers to work with the larger levy paying employers as almost like account managers, and that's where we found a really useful investment to make sure that that large employer is getting a comprehensive service, and we're doing quite a lot of the work for them. I think this is a bigger issue, and those of you are familiar with the good assessor and the work that I did in the last 20 years, I think we have to really fundamentally redesign the assessor role. Certainly with the college I work with, all of those assessors are now being redesignated as workplace tutors. Now they've had the training, they obviously have got a different set of conditions and payment schedules now. In most cases pay is being increased, but that includes now more emphasis on the preparation of teaching learning, particularly for the standards. They must be able to deliver elements of English and maths in the workplace or through the day block release or online. Learning support is now an aspect, so they can identify learning support and wherever possible for its literacy and numeracy, provide it and record that through the e-portfolio, OneFile or whatever. And of course, any other forms of support that we're providing to individual apprentices. So I think the assessor role is very different, and that will be the flavour of another of our webinars in this series. I think all of the staff in your organisation need to have some basic training and awareness raising on the standards and the requirements of endpoint assessment, particularly if that's linking also to the changes in T-levels that's going to occur after 18-19. We've invested a fair bit in the training of our sales team, who obviously are now aware that there are quite different motivations and behaviours in the markets. And obviously we've got new things to offer in terms of standards rather than frameworks, as well as some of the things that we're offering as selling up in terms of, for example, recruitment, talent spotting, and for example, of bespoke learning. So they are absolutely clued up and have been very hard at working with existing and also with new employers. And I think for me, you have to really start to talk to all the, as I said right at the very beginning, I think this is a fundamental change in the nature of training in the post-16 sector. It's an organisational change at different levels, the national organisation in terms of of England, of the regions, and obviously within your own organisation. And I think that means a change in culture. How can we be more tuned in to that market much more quickly, you know, in terms of responsiveness, flexibility, and also in terms of being to deliver some of those things that the national agenda is about in terms of skills, particularly in the STEM subjects, and obviously at higher levels, including degree apprenticeships. I think that's very fundamental change. Hopefully you found that useful. It does hopefully provide a bit of a checklist, because you can look at each one of the areas and think, oh yeah, we have, you know, we've got ways of working and a process in place. We've not necessarily tested it. We've done our fundamental review. There'll be others that say, well, we're halfway through it, or others might be saying, well, I'm new to the game, and maybe I've been given responsibility for apprenticeship in my organisation, and this would be a useful checklist for me. Please, because these have been drawn from all those different things we've done that's been provided to us by ETF, by the various checklists, particularly checklists after we were as we were putting the ROATP together, and after, that was very useful. So I think, just in conclusion, the apprenticeship reforms are one of the most significant changes. I've said that. It is critical that your organisation as a training provider has a clear strategy and detailed operational plans. And I think from what we've said, most of you have got that either in full or in place. Use this as an opportunity to review the fundamentals of your apprenticeship offer. In other words, a root and branch review to change and improve that offer to better meet the changing needs of the economy, particularly for higher skills. Employers who want to make sure they get really good value for their investment with you, even if it's only a 10% investment, but also learners, because they're at the very heart of this, and the whole community that we serve, including their parents and other people. I think the failure to do this, or to say, well, let's just roll what we've done in the past, or just wait and see, is too much of an eyes wide shut approach to me. I think it's better to be eyes wide open, even if that starts to raise fundamental issues, at least you're aware of them. And if you don't, I think that could have very serious impacts on your future viability. It certainly means that you might not be able to provide as much in the form of apprenticeships, if at all. So I think and implicit in all of this has been that one of the key areas that you will be doing all the way through every strand of this is, what's your quality assurance, what's your quality improvement? We know that Ofsted clearly has a key role in looking after the quality of experience, but so will the Institute for Apprenticeships, which has got that very, very broad brief as well. So I think what runs all the way through this, which is taken as a given, is that the only type of apprenticeships you should be planning for are high quality ones, and not just chasing the targets or the numbers. So thanks very much for the questions. Manik, we've had the questions. Thank you. That's great news. Yeah, thank